Today we are reviewing The Devil and Karl Marx by Paul Kengor, Chapter 3. The title of this chapter is Governed by a Demon, ? And it continues what we saw in the prologue in Chapter 1. Again, we really don't have any kind of commentary on Karl Marx's ideas or his thoughts. It speaks entirely to his character, his life situation, his relationship with his parents and his friends, such as Engels, without necessarily going into any of the ideas that he actually had. There is a bit between page 60 and 61, and a little bit on 62 and 63, where they talk about Marx and Lutheranism, and how Marx appreciated Luther for making a break from the religion of Rome. Marx called it, an emancipation. As the revolution then began in the brain of the monk, so now it begins in the brain of the philosopher. They comment on how this was necessarily a bad thing because he was anti-Catholic Church, while skipping over the parts of his message that seem to suggest that in reality he was anti-established religion and anti-power-wielding religion as a bludgeon to control the masses. This is why he was against the Catholic Church specifically. They also start to talk about the Crusades, and rather than try to address what the Crusades were and weren't, they go off on their own tangent. They say the Crusades, generally misunderstood and maligned to this day, were pursued by various popes, beginning with the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, etc. Each crusade had to meet the requirements of just war theory. They don't go into what just war theory is or why it's important here. They don't talk about that at all. They really don't want to paint the Crusades in anything of a negative light. They try not to highlight them at all, except to say that they're not as bad as people say they were. They even include here, Karl Marx reversed this entirely, portraying the Crusades as the period when, quote, Western Europe, as late as the 18th century, undertook a holy war against the infidel Turks for the possession of the Holy Sepulchre. This was a complete and outrageous reversal of which side had persecuted which. Of course, Marx's understanding of the Crusades is now the consensus of secular leftists today. What is worse, they are not the only ones who subscribe to that view. What they do here is they try to downplay the impact of the Crusades. They try to say that, first of all, the Crusades weren't as bad as people have described them, and second of all, they didn't occur in the way that people said that they occurred. It's kind of similar to the narrative and thoughts around the War of Northern Aggression, if you're familiar with that thought. The idea that the South didn't start the war in the Civil War, the North did. There are a lot of reasons why people do this, but for the most part, they tend to be historical revisionism, where people don't necessarily like the connotations that come along with the established historical record. And I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying, again, to besmirch Marx's character, to say, well, Marx was wrong about this too. And look, he's just against the church, that he just hates the church. That's his whole, purpose in being. Which may be true, but highlighting the Crusades specifically is probably a bad way to go about proving that. I think that they are historically inaccurate in how they portray the Crusades as occurring differently than described by historians the world over, that they've got some kind of novel narrative that they can provide. But they don't actually provide that narrative. They just reject what historians today understand the Crusades to be. They then go on to talk about how Karl Marx was poor because he was bad at managing his money, that he refused to hold a job, that he wanted to be a full-time intellectual. They go on for pages and pages and pages and pages about this, calling him lazy, calling him do nothing, calling him not a worker. They clearly don't consider any of the writing that he did or any of the ideas that he proposed as being valuable. And it's interesting that they mention this because they speak of Luther, Martin Luther specifically. They speak of Martin Luther as being prominent and important in the same vein as they reject Marx. Now, Martin Luther was priest. He didn't produce anything. The only thing that he, quote, produced, unquote, was religion and religious ideas. And that's important. That's valuable. That provides value to society. Ideas are good. Ideas are valuable. Being able to explain new things to people provides value. The fact that they want to reject that here is a little distressing. We need academics. We need people to push philosophy forward and to push new ideas forward, because that's how we grow as a species. That's how we adapt. That's where new technology and new things come from. On pages 72 and 73, they talk about how Marx was not very well groomed, how he did not shave, he did not shower, he had boils all over his face. I don't really see the purpose in highlighting all of this. Well, I do see the purpose, but we'll get to that in a moment. On page 75 and 76, they talk about a pact with the devil, where they talk about some of Marx's kids and some of the letters that Marx's father wrote to Marx, again, trying to prove that Marx was a bad guy or a Satanist. They write on page 79, Marx had wasted over 2 decades writing Das Kapital, a long, ridiculous tome, a waste of money as well as time. He had initially received a $300 advance for the book, but extended over 23 years of drawn-out writing. It equated to a little over $12 a year. They don't adjust for inflation, because why would they, right? That would be absurd. But the other thing that they do here is they inject their ideology, and they really have done this throughout the book anytime that they've referenced Marx or his ideas. They don't address his ideas, they just inject their ideology on top of them, just dismiss them, and get back to besmirching Marx's character, talking about his relationship with Satan at this point, talking about his hatred of religion, and talking about how this makes him necessarily a bad person. They don't really have any interest in talking about his ideas, again, just his character. Pages 84 and 85, they talk about his racism, the fact that he was deeply and profoundly racist, which is true and awful. In 86 and 87, 88 and 89, as well as 90, they talk about his anti-Semitism, again, extremely true. He was very anti-Semitic and should rightfully be condemned for it. Then they go on to continue talking about him in ways that are entirely assaults on his character. They still, to this point, at the end of chapter 3, have not talked about his ideas except to make snide, snippy remarks without addressing them. The only thing that they have addressed is this core hypothesis, which seems to be the purpose of the book, that Marx is a devil worshipper, a Satanist, or all of the above. Now, to confirm this hypothesis, I went through, and I wasn't going to do this, but I went through and I skimmed through the rest of the chapters in the book. I looked at the chapter titles, I looked at some of the headlines. So here's one from chapter 4, Meeting a Remarkable Monster. Here is another one that comes to us from page 159, talking about how Marx is part of the Satanic Scourge. I'm just going to flip pages and look for a random page here that has another title for a chapter. Here's one on page 225, Obliterating All Religion. All right, let me turn to another random page. Here's one, 269, The Devil Doth Quote the Scripture. This is the entire thrust and the premise of the book, and so I'm going to set it down, set it aside, and talk for a moment. The entire premise of the book, the entire idea, is to make a religious argument that Karl Marx was an agent of the devil who was a bad person, was engaged in devil worship, was engaged in radical deconstructive atheism, was bad to his family, was bad to his friends, was bad with money, had this just horrible, awful character, stank to high heaven, drank his life away, and ultimately, in his own lifetime, amounted to nothing. And all of those statements may be true. I really don't have any interest in addressing them. I don't think that any of the people that have interest in his ideas have any interest in addressing them. I think when people look at Marx or want to talk about Marx, the things that they want to talk about more broadly are his ideas, and not even necessarily communism. Das Kapital, as they mentioned, is a tome. It's 1,000 pages. The first 200 of which are just laying out what's actually occurring economically in Europe at time of writing. It talks about industrialization and how the markets have changed from this agrarian to this feudal to this now capitalist system, where under the new standard, instead of feudal lords owning the land and therefore the means of production and charging rents to their tenants, to their peasants, instead you've got these factories, and the people that own them own capital. They own money. They don't own land. Land isn't as valuable anymore. It's not about how spread out you are. It's about how much you can produce. And Marx then takes that and expands on it further for another 800 pages and says, this is what I think is going to happen next. And those ideas are extremely interesting, and some of them are very, very wrong, okay? Let's make no mistake. Marx did not get everything right. There is a lot that he got wrong. He probably got more wrong than right. But they don't address any of that here. They don't even touch on it. The only things that they do as far as his ideas are berate them and insult them and trash them without discussing what they were or what they are or why they matter or why they don't matter, why they're wrong or why they're right. Early on in the book, they gave the 10 tenets of Marxism, the 10 basic ideas that would found this new socialist society that he was proposing or that he thought would come to be. And they don't talk any further about whether those ideas are good or bad or right or wrong. They just kind of move on. And I'm really disappointed, I gotta say. I didn't think that this was the book that I was going to be looking through, because, again, in the preamble they said that they certainly couldn't prove that he was a Satan worshiper or engaged in black masses. But everything that they've done in the book so far has been intended to prove exactly that. So I'm not really sure who this book is for. I feel like maybe they're trying to preach to a religious audience and trying to persuade them to hate Marx even more than they already do. Maybe they're trying to speak to the evangelical right in the United States. Maybe that's just their core target audience, and it's just circling the wagons around an idea that they've already had and have been expressing. I don't really know, and I'm a little disappointed that this is the book that I got, and that this is the book that I ended up with, and that these are the hours that I've spent reading it. So I'm not going to put any more time into it. I don't think that it's worth my time. I don't think that it's worth your time. I think I'm going to move on to something new. Now, with that being said, I have picked up Justice as Fairness, a restatement by John Rawls. And for those that don't know, Rawls is one of the great American philosophers who laid out a system and an ideology that is compatible with capitalism, that is designed to create a system of government that is just and is fair to people. This is kind of more where my interests lie, and more the type of social and economic commentary that I was hoping to get from this other book. Next week we'll be getting into this book by Rawls. We'll continue to go chapter by chapter through some of his ideas, some of his thoughts, and possibly even talking about some of the thought experiments that he proposed, and running through those thought experiments ourselves to compare notes and see if we land where he did. I'm really looking forward to it, and I will talk to you all next week. Thanks for listening.